With a new president in the White House, what's next for China-United States relations? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. After 4 years of the Trump administration that saw relations between the United States and China sink to new lows, could that be about to change? When Joe Biden was sworn in as president this week, he talked about Washington's readiness to re-engage with the world again. China has congratulated President Biden and is calling for, quote, courage and wisdom to help put China-U.S. relations back on the right track. But there are big challenges ahead on both sides as they try to move on from the legacy of the Trump administration. Let's go to our panel right now. Joining me from Beijing is Victor Gao. He's an international relations expert and is also chair professor at Soochow University. With us too from Washington, D.C. is Cheng Li. He is the director of the China Center and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Also with us here in Washington is Jeff Moon. He served as assistant U.S. trade representative for China during the Obama administration. And with us too from Portland, Oregon is Yan Liang. She is a professor of economics at Willamette University. Welcome to all of you. And Victor, let me start with you. Joe Biden is now the new president of the United States. It's been a very tumultuous 4 years in the relationship between China and the United States under President Trump. What's been the response in Beijing to the new president?
I think China welcomes Joe Biden as the new president of the United States, and his presidency creates rare opportunities to re-engage between China and the United States, try to enhance better understanding, try to stay on top of all the differences and difficulties that do exist, and strive for greater benefit for the American people as well as the Chinese people. This is truly a rare opportunity in light of the 4 very troubled and poisoned years created mostly by Trump and his associates in Washington for the China-U.S. relations. So we are very positive. Welcome aboard, and let's really re-engage with each other.
Victor, before I move on to the rest of the panel, I'm going to ask you about one other significant big development from China. Beijing has announced sanctions against 28 United States officials, including the former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Other officials include high-ranking officials, include Trump officials and advisors, including Peter Navarro, Robert O'Brien, John Bolton, Steve Bannon as well. What's behind the action that China has taken?
I think from the Chinese perspective, these groups of people have really been the main culprits for the poisoning of China-U.S. relations to the detriment of not only the Chinese interest, but also fundamentally the American interest. They have been fabricating all the falsehoods and allegations, and they have really muddled the water, and they hijacked the incoming Biden administration's agenda in dealing with China. Therefore, I think the sanctions are very much targeted against these individuals. They are barred from entering into China. They are barred from engaging with any Chinese enterprises in the future. I think it sends a very good signal to these people that there are consequences if you mishandle your responsibility, if you falsely make representations to the rest of the world. And I think this also sends a good message to the Biden administration. China wants to deal whatever that's left with the Trump administration separately and start anew with the Biden administration. This is truly a historical moment for China and the United States to look at each other, to size up each other, and try to move forward in a more positive and clean way, showing decency and respect for each other, for their own benefit, and for world peace and development. This is very important.
Jeff Moon, what do you make of these Chinese sanctions? It goes after individuals in the United States, and does it to a certain extent underscore how bad relations got between China and the United States under Trump?
Well, I think these sanctions are petty, unfortunate. It's time to move on. I think that we need to have a reset, as Professor Gao is suggesting here. And I think both sides are actually ready for a reset. There are various signals that are coming out of both Beijing and Washington. But there are some who are signaling publicly that it's time for the daily insults and sanctions to stop, that we need to resume some sort of communication. We need to start some kind of cooperation, probably on climate change and other issues, and we need to achieve some small steps of progress. I think opening the consulates that were closed would be something that's quite useful. It gets trickier when you get to the bigger issues that are on the table. We need to, at some point, re-engage on what Trump called phase 2, and the rest of us called the centerpiece issues in the economic relationship. But if China ever wants to engage and resolve its differences with the United States, which are getting worse year by year, now is the time to do that. Biden and his team bring more experience to their jobs than anyone else has in a very long time. And in contrast to Trump, they have deep foreign policy experience. They've dealt with China. They know a lot of the officials. And as Professor Gao says, this is a real opportunity to sit down and to make some progress.
Cheng Li, in his inaugural speech on Wednesday, President Biden talked about the U.S. wanting to engage with the world once again. Of course, that comes after 4 years of the Trump administration, in which it always talked about America first. But let's listen to what Biden had to say.
So here's my message to those beyond our borders. America has been tested, and we've come out stronger for it. We will repair our alliances and engage with the world once again, not to meet yesterday's challenges, but today's and tomorrow's challenges.
So, Cheng Li, you know, the relationship between China and the United States hit new lows under President Trump. So how does China and the U.S. now re-engage and build this new relationship?
Well, first of all, President speech is excellent. It's not just by Cold War reality and his team. It's very pragmatic. I think that, both tend to the right path. But China, it should have empathy because it's some of the problems Trump administration for China. It does have some concerns because the experience a lot of wealth over the past decade.
Okay, Cheng Li, my apologies, I'm sorry, but we're having problems with your audio from your office, so we'll try to get that fixed. But let me move on now to, actually, let me move back to Victor Gao. Victor Gao, what do you think needs to happen in the first instance for this relationship to be rebuilt?
Well, I think both China and the United States need to do a lot of things going forward. We can start with the simple things. For example, the United States can reopen its consulate general in Chengdu on the condition that China can reopen its consulate in Houston, and China and the United States can provide a greater freedom for the journalists of each other's country to operate in the other country. This is very important. We do need to have freedom of press to report on each other so that people in China and the United States can better understand each other and also give a correct and accurate characterization to what the Chinese students doing in the United States. These are students, they do study and education in the United States, but they pay for their tuition, they subsidize the local economies, and the American universities also need the inflow of high-quality Chinese students. So we can start with the simple things, but gradually we rebuild the trust, and the Chinese people and the American people will realize that they are not enemies of each other. Yeah. They need to get along. They need to understand each other.
Okay. Cheng Li is back with us. Cheng Li, that question that I posed to you, how do these two countries re-engage with each other?
Well, for China, it needs to have empathy, particularly to understand United States, the middle class is shrinking, and there's some legitimate concern. For United States, we should realize that China has a leverage, and China's domestic market is huge, and the so-called dual circulations will work in China's favor. And the recent signing of the ICEP, and also the EU-China investment agreement, arguably the largest trade agreement in history in terms of ICEP, and plus the EU-China investment agreement. So I think this gives us some challenge for the United States. But for both sides, I think we should abandon zero-sum game thinking.
Okay, let me bring in Yan Liang into this conversation. Yan Liang, the Bloomberg News Agency had a piece this week pointing out that Trump really doesn't have much to show for his tough China policies. And it points out that it was actually Americans and not the Chinese who bore most of the cost of Trump's tariffs. What do you think happens now to the trade war and those tariffs?
Right, so that's a great question. So I think the trade tensions will de-escalate under Biden's presidency. And the most important reason for that is, the Trump's 3 years of trade war very clearly demonstrated that, for one, the trade war was not going to be able to help to reduce the U.S.'s trade balance, actually trade deficit. So when you look at the numbers, 2017, the U.S. trade deficit was, $276 billion against China. But by 2019, after the 2 years of trade war, the U.S. trade deficit with China actually increased by 20 billion to reach 296 billion. So trade war is not going to help to reduce the trade imbalance. And second is trade war is not going to really help to push China to budge on some of the fundamental interests and some of the red-lined issues. And number three, as you just pointed out, trade war was very costly, and mostly that cost was borne by American consumers and businesses. A report that was released by January, a study commissioned by the U.S.-China Business Council has shown that the trade war has cost the United States 245,000 jobs at the peak. So I think Biden will be wise to halt that trade war, even though he did indicate he would not remove the tariffs for the moment before he had a full review of the trade deal and consult with the allies. Right.
So Yan Liang, how do you see this relationship, the economic relationship, evolving?
Right. So I think the economic relationships will be still, in the light of the U.S., will be still seeing China as a major competitor, both in economic leadership and also technological leadership. So I think at some places they will still, compete quite, aggressively. But hopefully they would also find common interests. For example, Biden has talked about the 4 crises in the United States, right? There's a pandemic, there is economic recession, there's a climate change, and the social injustice, racial injustice. So I think on all these fronts, coordinating and even collaborating with China would do more benefits than harms for the United States. So, and then I think that Biden has made it clear that the entire sort of engagement with China will be couched on the U.S.'s domestic strategies. In other words, Biden has pledged to invest billions of dollars in infrastructure, in energy, in education to boost the U.S.'s competitiveness and also boost workers' bargaining power. So I think all of this will be helpful to improve the U.S.'s competitiveness and its leadership without really sort of undermining China, because I think weakening China cannot really strengthen the United States.
Jeff Moon, do you think Joe Biden will want to reverse these trade war type policies that have been in place for the last 4 years, especially at a time when the U.S. economy has taken quite a hit from the pandemic?
Well, he has said very clearly that China issues will not be his top priority. His top priority will be the 4 issues that Professor Yan outlined. And I agree with her assessment of the way he's described his economic agenda. So he's not going to be turning to these issues until mid-year or next year at the earliest. In the meantime, he's going to be consulting with our allies to see how we can possibly work together. And there will be lower level discussions with the Chinese to see if we can achieve some of the smaller progress that Professor Gao described. As for the trade war, there are both economic and political dimensions that are worth noticing. From the economic perspective, Trump fought the right issues in the Section 301 complaint, but used the wrong tactics. Tariffs were the wrong tactics, and he failed. The deficit is now larger than it was when he actually came to power. But those issues remain. The playing field is still not level for foreigners doing business with China, and Biden will vigorously pursue those issues going forward in the future, and there will be conflict if they are not addressed. From a political perspective, you'll notice toward the end of Trump's term, Trump stopped talking about anything but fulfillment of the Phase 2 deal. And these issues were used for political purposes to demonstrate toughness on China and get the support of voters. that political overhang still lingers. And Biden still feels that. Trump has intentionally tried to impose that political burden on him. And so I think that Biden will not in the short term reduce the tariffs. He may do things to minimize the burden of it by perhaps granting more exclusions. And eventually he might like to phase out the tariffs, but I think it's going to take a little bit of time. And we're going to have to see what the reaction is from the Chinese side on all the other issues that we've been discussing and whether there is a genuine effort to make progress.
Victor Gao, the man that Joe Biden wants to be his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, he is signaling a very tough approach on China. He was speaking recently at confirmation hearings here at the U.S. Congress, and this is what he had to say. Let's listen.
I also believe that President Trump was right in taking a tougher approach to China. I disagree very much with the way that he went about it in a number of areas, but the basic principle was the right one, and I think that's actually helpful. We can outcompete China and remind the world that a government of the people, for the people, can deliver for its people.
So, Victor, here's the man who could be the United States' most senior diplomat, agreeing with what Donald Trump had done. What if Biden decides to double down on what Donald Trump had done?
Well, I think, first of all, President Donald Trump's approach to the trade war, to dealing with China, is very similar to his approach in dealing with the COVID-19 virus. It will not work. The trade war will not be won. The trade war will be destructive both of China as well as the United States. All the tariffs he bragged about are not paid by China or the Chinese government. It's paid by the American consumers and the American importers. This is a simple fact that everyone will realize. And I truly believe that Biden and his team will fully realize they have enough brain power to read the news, to know the facts. That's simple. So for Mr. Blinken, for Joe Biden, President Joe Biden and his team, I wish them good luck, and I hope they will come up with a very realistic understanding of the situation, both in the United States, in the rest of the world, and here in China, and then they can tailor-make their strategy accordingly. They cannot start on wrong presumptions and a very wrong characterization of the situation, and I believe the Chinese people and the American people will need to get along with each other, and then whatever differences there are, which are many, we need to handle them very carefully, very cautiously, and eventually I think both China and the United States will be winners, rather than there will be mutual destruction of each other's legitimate interest. So there will be a lot of negotiations and tough talk, but hopefully both China and the United States can move forward, benefiting their own people and also the rest of the world.
Cheng Li, China, of course, has become more prominent on the world stage, both as an economic and a political power since Joe Biden was last in the White House. Do you think that that dynamic will impact their relationship now? Would it make it more difficult for them to rebuild the relationship?
Well, I think both sides need to make some adjustment. I think I just want to add one thing about Blinken's remark in the Senate hearing. I certainly think different people have different reading. In terms of the tough stance on China, I think we should make a distinction between tough stance and the hostile stance, because the previous administration is really quite hostile approach to China. Take that one, and also we should notice that both President and also Secretary of State, nominee, during the campaign and after campaign, stated that it was Russia, not China, that interfered in the U.S. election. And they see China and Russia very differently. And they talk about the competition, not confrontation. So China is not the enemy. So I think this is very, very important. But of course, there's a pressure on China, on international coalition, and there's also human rights and other issues. I think that, again, Blinken said, in different occasions, that the U.S.-China should raise the top, not raise the bottom. I think this gives you a kind of his different approach to China.
Yan Liang, of course, during the Trump administration, China moved to develop new partnerships with other countries, other trading blocs, new markets as well. I mean, just recently we saw China and the EU sign a trade agreement. I should point out that agreement still needs to be ratified by the European Parliament. But could the future mean more competition between major trading blocs like the United States and the EU to do business with China?
Right. Well, I don't think trade is a zero-sum game. I think all these different countries can trade with each other, enjoy that competitive advantage, enjoy that scale of the economy of scale. So I don't think necessarily this is sort of a zero-sum game. If China is doing more businesses with the EU, then it will do less business with the United States. And if I may, I wanted to go back quickly on the point about being tough. And so I think, being tough, it's one thing, but again, to what end, right? If it's one thing to be tough to make China to have sort of regime change, it's another thing to be firm but consistent to push China to continue to reform and open. And there's also the matter of how to be tough, right? Having this destructive trade war is one way of being tough, but the other way of being tough is really to build that multilateral system and to provide guidance and help for China to, for example, protect its intellectual property rights and open the market in an orderly manner.
Jeff Moon, getting back to that agreement between China and the EU, does it give European companies a bit more of a competitive edge when dealing with China? We know that the Biden people are not happy with that deal at all. But long term, though, what are the chances of perhaps a bilateral deal between China and the United States?
Well, a bilateral investment treaty between the U.S. and China was being negotiated right up to the very end of the Obama administration. I was in those negotiations, and I know that 90% of the issues were outstanding. That other 10% were the hardest part, though. So there have been extensive discussions about these issues within the U.S. The China-EU agreement is kind of interesting. It was struck at the end of the year, the end of Germany's year, and I think is more politically symbolic than it is economically symbolic. The political symbolism of China and the EU uniting is powerful. It's similar to the RCEP agreement that China is a part of. But I think any trade negotiator will tell you that until the document is written down, and the EU-China agreement is not written down yet, until it's all written down, fully translated, and fully understood by all the parties, you don't have an agreement.
Yeah.
So, and in addition, the European Parliament needs to approve this. The terms are not publicly known, and many of the terms, many of the hot button issues were resolved with Chinese promises to do various vague and unenforceable things. References again to the investment law that forbids technology transfer without any details on how that's going to be done, signing International Labor Organization treaties supposedly to address concerns about Xinjiang. So I think the more people in Europe know about this, the less impressed they're going to be. I wonder whether it's going to be passed. And again, as a political symbol, I think it's very strong. Economically, I'm not so sure, given China's track record on non-performance of its promises under the WTO and other agreements,
right.
that this is really going to mean as much as China thinks.
Victor, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I think the most important fact is that China is the largest market in the world, and it's still growing very rapidly compared with other major economies in the world. Therefore, I think the real driver should be whether you really want to engage with the China market, whether you want to export more goods to China, whether you want to make sure that your companies can invest in China with full protection of their legitimate interest, etc. So in this context, I think the comprehensive investment agreement between China and EU, the negotiations of which have already successfully concluded, it's yet to be signed, of course, will create a very solid opportunity for European countries at large to engage with China. This is the most important thing. Of course, there are many difficulties. There are many issues to be further addressed. But I think other than the China market, there is no other comparable markets left in the world. Why? Because China market is about 5 times as big as India's market, and China's market is recovering very soon. For the United States, it's the same thing. You either write off China and you suffer the consequences, or you very carefully engage or re-engage with China, and your people, the farmers, the manufacturers in your own country, benefit from this positive re-engagement. So I think we need to look at the very important overarching issues first, and then tailor-make our policies accordingly, both in China as well as in Washington. And I truly believe that President Biden and his team have much greater sophistication and brain power to come up with a tactic and a strategy which will serve the American people, but also it will keep the ball rolling forward for mutual benefit between China and the United States.
Cheng Li, what do you see as the main areas of cooperation between China and the United States? I mean, there is one issue on which there is common ground, a lot of common ground, and that is the battle against climate change. Both China and the United States led the signing of the Paris Climate Accord. Of course, Trump pulled the United States out of that accord, but Biden has now put the United States back in there. Do you see this kind of cooperation being expanded into other areas?
Well, early on, Jeff mentioned that China or U.S.China relation is not the top agenda for Biden administration. That was right. But 3 out of the 4 top agenda for Biden administration are related to China. COVID-19, there's no such thing for the national cure, only a global cure. So collaboration with China, and especially in the vaccine production and the global distribution, is essential. Now, economic recovery, I mean, you cannot imagine the 2 largest economy in the world in a bit infighting. Then both countries are doing well. So I think this is very, very important for economic cooperation. And you mentioned about climate change. This is one of the top agenda. China's participation is essential. I think you can see a really long list of cooperation, and also nuclear cooperation, anti-terrorism, energy security, cybersecurity, international refugee flow, international drug trafficking, and most importantly, urgently, is the global damage.
Okay. We are going to have to leave it there. Time has caught up with us. It's been a great discussion. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. See you next time.